Hello, Dan Alasso again, Making History, with another primary source reading for American history. And in this one, I want to mention that in addition to the 4-volume set of U.S. history primary sources that I'm using that were printed at the end of the 19th, beginning of the 20th century, I'm also going to check every once in a while for other sources that perhaps shed some additional light on what people were thinking about those events in the past. There are fewer compilations of such accounts, honestly, especially by voices critical to the mainstream at the time, or to the ruling party then, or to the dominant narrative more recently or now. One of these sources, of course, is Howard Zinn, and the people who have then followed in his footsteps. A People's History of the United States is a really valuable counter-argument to the master narrative. And many of the sources that it mentions are worth looking into, if only to see if I agree with the way that Zinn is using them. One such source that he mentions very early in A People's History, and that is also in his primary source companion book, Voices of A People's History, is Bartolomé de Las Casas. Las Casas lived from 1484 to 1566. He was a landowner originally, who emigrated with his father to Hispaniola in 1502 when he was 18 years old, and then helped to pacify the island. In 1506, he returned to Europe and was ordained, and then he went back to the Caribbean. He participated in the conquest of Cuba. Las Casas received an encomienda for his service, which in practical terms meant that he was both a landowner and that he controlled the semi-enslaved natives, whom he was nominally responsible for Christianizing. But in the New World, it was much more about getting work out of them than it was bringing them to the church. Over time, as Las Casas observed the conduct of his fellow Spaniards and the devastation of the native population, he became convinced that the colony was unjust. He renounced his encomienda, actually, and became an advocate for natives and a recorder, and one of the only recorders that we have, of the conditions and the cruelty that they faced. One thing to note, though, like all Europeans at the time, Las Casas had really no idea of a germ theory of medicine. He had no understanding of the way that European diseases were affecting native populations. What we now call the Columbian Exchange killed about 90 to 95% of the native peoples of the Americas, and that began in the Caribbean. Not understanding this, Las Casas attributed the depopulation of the Caribbean islands that he talks about in this text to primarily Spanish cruelty and occasionally the suicides of hopeless natives. Although this isn't the whole story, I don't think that it really detracts from his accounts of Spanish actions. So I'm going to read a little bit of Las Casas writing about 1542 about the devastation of the Indies. So here we go. The Indies were discovered in the year 1492. In the following year, a great many Spaniards were there with the intention of settling the land. Thus, 49 years have passed since the first settlers penetrated the land, the first, so claimed, being the large and most happy isle called Hispaniola, which is 600 leagues in circumference. Around it, in all directions, there are other islands, some very big, others very small, and all of them, as we saw with our own eyes, densely populated with native peoples called Indians. This large island was perhaps the most densely populated place in the world. There must be close to 200 leagues of land on this island, and the seacoast has been explored for more than 10,000 leagues. And each day, more of it is being explored. And all the land so far discovered is a beehive of people. It is as though God had crowded into these lands the great majority of mankind. And of the infinite universe of humanity, these people are the most guileless, the most devoid of wickedness and duplicity, the most obedient and faithful to their masters and to the Spanish Christians whom they serve. They are by nature the most humble, patient, and peaceable, holding no grudges, free from embroilments, neither excitable nor quarrelsome. These people are the most devoid of rancors, hatreds, or desire for vengeance of any people in the world. And because they are so weak and complacent, they are less able to endure heavy labor and soon die of no matter what malady. The sons of nobles among us, brought up in the enjoyments of life's refinements, are no more delicate than these Indians, even those among them who are of the lowest rank of laborers. They are also poor people, for they not only possess but little, but have no desire to possess worldly goods. For this reason, they are not arrogant, embittered, or greedy. Their repasts are such that the food of the Holy Fathers in the desert can scarcely be more parsimonious, scant, and poor. As to their dress, they are generally naked, with only their pudenda covered somewhat. And when they cover their shoulders, it is with a square cloth no more than 2 varas in size. They have no beds, but sleep on a kind of matting, or else in a kind of suspended net called hammocks. They are very clean in their person, with alert, intelligent minds, docile and open to doctrine, very apt to receive our holy Catholic faith, to be endowed with virtuous customs, and to behave in a godly fashion. And once they begin to hear the tidings of the faith, they are so insistent on knowing more and on taking the sacraments of the church and on observing the divine cult that truly the missionaries who are here need to be endowed by God with great patience in order to cope with such eagerness. Some of the secular Spaniards who have been here for many years say that the goodness of the Indians is undeniable, and that if this gifted people could be brought to know the one true God, they would be the most fortunate people in the world. Yet, into this sheepfold, into this land of meek outcasts, there came some Spaniards who immediately behaved like ravening wild beasts, wolves, tigers, or lions that had been starved for many days. And Spaniards have behaved in no other way during the last 40 years, down to the present time, for they are still acting like ravening beasts, killing, terrorizing, afflicting, torturing, and destroying the native peoples, doing all this with the strangest and most varied new methods of cruelty never seen or heard of before, and to such a degree that this island of Hispaniola, once so populous, having a population that I estimated to be more than 3 millions, has now a population of barely 200 persons. The island of Cuba is nearly as long as the distance between Valladolid and Rome. It is now almost completely depopulated. San Juan, Puerto Rico, and Jamaica are 2 of the largest, most productive, and attractive islands. Both are now deserted and devastated. On the northern side of Cuba and Hispaniola lie the neighboring Lucayos, comprising more than 60 islands, including those called gigantes, beside numerous other islands, some small, some large. The least felicitous of them were more fertile and beautiful than the gardens of the King of Seville. They have the healthiest lands in the world, where lived more than 500,000 souls. They are now deserted, inhabited by not a single living creature. All the people were slain or died after being taken into captivity and brought to the island of Hispaniola to be sold as slaves. When the Spaniards saw that some of these had escaped, they sent a ship to find them. And it voyaged for 3 years among the islands, searching for those who had escaped being slaughtered. For a good Christian had helped them escape, taking pity on them, and had won them over to Christ. Of these, there were 11 persons, and these I saw. More than 30 other islands in the vicinity of San Juan are for the most part, and for the same reason, depopulated and the land laid waste. Of these islands, I estimate There are 2,100 leagues of land that have been ruined and depopulated, empty of people. As for the vast mainland, which is 10 times larger than all Spain, even including Aragon and Portugal, containing more land than the distance between Seville and Jerusalem, or more than 2,000 leagues, we are sure that our Spaniards, with their cruel and abominable acts, have devastated the land and exterminated the rational people who fully inhabited it. We can estimate very surely and truthfully that in the 40 years that have passed, with the infernal actions of the Christians, there have been unjustly slain more than 12 million men, women, and children. In truth, I believe, without trying to deceive myself, that the number of the slain is more like 15 million. The common ways mainly employed by the Spaniards who call themselves Christian and who have gone there to extirpate those pitiful nations and wipe them off the earth is by unjustly waging cruel and bloody wars. Then, when they have slain all those who fought for their lives, or to escape the tortures they would have to endure, that is to say, when they have slain all the native rulers and young men, since the Spaniards usually spare only the women and children who are subjected to the hardest and bitterest servitude ever suffered by man or beast, they enslave any survivors. With these infernal methods of tyranny, they debase and weaken countless numbers of those pitiful Indian nations. Their reason for killing and destroying such an infinite number of souls is that the Christians have an ultimate aim, which is to acquire gold, and to swell themselves with riches in a very brief time, and thus rise to a high estate disproportionate to their merits. It should be kept in mind that their insatiable greed and ambition, the greatest ever seen in the world, is the cause of their villainies. And also, those lands are so rich and felicitous, the native people so meek and patient, so easy to subject, that our Spaniards have no more consideration of them than beasts. And I say this from my own knowledge of the acts I witnessed. But I should not say than beasts, for thanks be to God, they have treated beasts with some respect. I should say instead like excrement on the public squares. And thus they have deprived the Indians of their lives and souls. For the millions I mentioned have died without the faith and without the benefit of sacraments. This is a well-known and proven fact, which even the tyrant governors, themselves killers, know and admit. And never have the Indians in all the Indies committed any act against the Spanish Christians until those Christians have first and many times committed countless cruel aggressions against them or against neighboring nations. For in the beginning, the Indians regarded the Spaniards as angels from heaven. Only after the Spaniards had used violence against them, killing, robbing, torturing, did the Indians ever rise up against them. On the island of Hispaniola was where the Spaniards first landed, as I have said. Here, those Christians perpetrated their first ravages and oppressions against the native peoples. This was the first land in the New World to be destroyed and depopulated by the Christians. And here they began their subjection of the women and children, to use them and ill-use them, eating the food they provided with their sweat and toil. The Spaniards did not content themselves with what the Indians gave them of their own free will, according to their ability, which was always too little to satisfy enormous appetites. For a Christian eats and consumes in one day an amount of food that would suffice to feed 3 houses inhabited by 10 Indians for 1 month. And they committed other acts of force and violence and oppression, which made the Indians realize that these men had not come from heaven. And some of the Indians concealed their foods, while others concealed their wives and children. And still others fled to the mountains to avoid the terrible transactions of the Christians. And the Christians attacked them with buffets and beatings until they finally laid hands on the nobles of the villages. Then they behaved with such temerity and shamelessness that the most powerful ruler of the islands had to see his own wife raped by a Christian officer. From that time onward, the Indians began to seek ways to throw the Christians out of their lands. They took up arms, but their weapons were very weak and of little service in offense and still less in defense. Because of this, the wars of the Indians against each other are little more than games played by children. And the Christians, with their horses and swords and pikes, began to carry out massacres and strange cruelties against them. They attacked the towns and spared neither the children nor the aged, nor pregnant women, nor women in childbed, not only stabbing them and dismembering them, but cutting them to pieces as if dealing with sheep in the slaughterhouse. They laid bets as to who, with one stroke of a sword, could split a man in two, or could cut off his head, or spill out his entrails with a single stroke of a pike. They took infants from their mothers' breasts, snatching them by the legs and pitching them headfirst against the crags, or snatched them by the arms and threw them into the rivers, roaring with laughter and saying as the babies fell into the water, "Boil there, you offspring of the devil." Other infants they put to the sword, along with their mothers and anyone else who happened to be nearby. They made some low, wide gallows on which the hanged victims' feet almost touched the ground, stringing up their victims in lots of 13, in memory of our Redeemer and his 12 apostles. Then set burning wood at their feet and thus burned them alive. To others they attached straw or wrapped their whole bodies in straw and set them afire. With still others, all those they wanted to capture alive, they cut off their hands and hung them round the victim's neck, saying, "Now go, carry the message," meaning, take the news to the Indians who have fled to the mountains. They usually dealt with chieftains and nobles in the following way. They made a grid of rods, which they placed on forked sticks, then lashed the victims to the grid and lighted a smoldering fire underneath, so that little by little, as those captives screamed in despair and torment, their souls would leave them. After the wars and the killings had ended, when usually there survived only some boys, some women, and children, these survivors were distributed among the Christians to be slaves. The repartimiento, or distribution, was made according to the rank and importance of the Christian to whom the Indians were allocated. One of them being given 30, another 40, still another 1 or 200. And besides the rank of the Christian, there was also to be considered in what favor he stood with the tyrant they called governor. The pretext was that these allocated Indians were to be instructed in the articles of the Christian faith, as if those Christians who were as a rule foolish and cruel and greedy and vicious could be the caretakers of souls. And the care they took was to send the men to the mines to dig for gold, which is intolerable labor, and to send the women into the fields of the big ranches to hoe and till the land, work suitable for strong men. Nor to either the men or the women did they give any food except herbs and legumes, things of little substance. The milk in the breasts of the women with infants dried up, and thus in short while the infants perished. And since men and women were separated, there could be no marital relations. And the men died in the mines, and the women died on the ranches from the same causes, exhaustion and hunger. And thus was depopulated that island, which had been densely populated. In a later passage, he talks about Cuba. He says, "In the year 1511, the Spaniards passed over the island of Cuba, which I have said is the same distance from Hispaniola as the distance between Valladolid and Rome, and which was a well-populated province. They began and ended in Cuba as they had done elsewhere, but with much greater acts of cruelty. Among the noteworthy outrages they committed was the one they perpetrated against the cacique, a very important noble by the name of Hatue, who had come to Cuba from Hispaniola with many of his people to flee the calamities and inhuman acts of the Christians. When he was told by certain Indians that the Christians were coming to Cuba, he assembled as many of his followers as he could. Now you must know that they are saying the Christians are coming here, and you know by experience how they have put so and so and so and so and so and other nobles to an end. And now they are coming from Haiti, which is Hispaniola, to do the same here. Do you know this? The Indians replied, "We do not know, but it may be that they are by nature wicked and cruel." And he told them, "No, they do not act only because of that, but because they have a God they greatly worship, and they want us to worship that God. And that is why they struggle with us and subject us and kill us." He had a basket full of gold and jewels, and he said, "You see their God here, the God of the Christians. If you agree to it, let us dance for this God. Who knows, it may please the God of the Christians, and then they will do us no harm." And his followers said all together, "Yes, that is good, that is good." And they danced around the basket of gold until they fell down exhausted. Then their chief, the cacique Hatue, said to them, "See there, if we keep this basket of gold, they will take it from us and will end up by killing us. So let us cast away the basket into the river." They all agreed to do this, and they flung the basket of gold into the river that was nearby. This cacique, Hatue, was constantly fleeing before the Christians from the time they arrived on the island of Cuba, since he knew them and of what they were capable. Now and then they encountered him, and he defended himself, but they finally killed him. And they did this for the sole reason that he had fled from those cruel and wicked Christians, and had defended himself against them. And when they captured him, and as many of his followers as they could, they burned them all at the stake. When tied to the stake, the cacique Hatue was told by a Franciscan friar who was present, an artless rascal, something about the God of the Christians and the articles of faith. And he was told what he could do in the brief time that remained to him in order to be saved and go to heaven. The cacique, who had never heard any of this before and was told he would go to Inferno, where if he did not adopt the Christian faith, he would suffer eternal torment, asked the Franciscan friar if Christians all went to heaven. When told that they did, he said he would prefer to go to hell. Such is the fame and honor that God and our faith have earned through the Christians who have gone out of the Indies. He goes on for quite a while in this vein. He talks later about the tyrant Spaniard, representative of the King of Spain, who demanded in the repartimiento that he be given 300 Indians. At the end of 3 months, Las Casas says, all but 30 of them had died of the hard labor on the mines, which is to say only a tenth of them had survived. He demanded another allocation of Indians, and they also perished in the same way. He demanded still another allocation, and those Indians also perished. He concludes towards the end of this passage, "In 3 or 4 months when I was there, more than 70,000 children, whose fathers and mothers had been sent to the mines, died of hunger." Now, of course, not everybody reading Las Casas' accounts believed him. And in 1550, Las Casas had a famous debate against a priest named Ginés de Sepúlveda in front of the Royal Council of Spain on the question of whether the Indians were even human beings and deserving of being treated like humans, or were they some type of subhumans and as such deserving the enslavement that they got. So I'll have more to say about that perhaps as we move forward. One thing I do want to mention though is that aside from the account of Columbus, which this book takes from Las Casas, it doesn't mention him at all. Now that may be partially due to the fact that this is a US history, but it may also partly reflect that Las Casas' version of these events is not that complimentary to the Europeans. In any case, I hope you found that a little bit interesting. Thanks very much for watching. I'll see you again